Today is Monday, March the 5th, 2001. My name is Myrna Ries, and I have the joy of interviewing Billie Frauman in my home on Orchid Lane in Dallas, Texas. Billie, I'm so glad that you're here with me today. We have known each other for many, many years, and I have great memories of you, and we will get into that as we proceed in the Dallas community. First, I'd like to ask you some personal questions, like where were you born and where did you spend your childhood?
I was born in Chicago and spent the growing up years there.
In Chicago?
In Chicago.
In the city, in the suburbs?
In the city.
Mm-hmm.
When I was growing up in Chicago, we lived near the beach along Sheridan Road, which now has high-rise buildings. Mm-hmm. The beach is no longer there. And Chicago has changed into a magnificent city.
Very beautiful.
Yes, which it wasn't when I was growing up.
Well, and it was a very exciting city, so what brought you to Dallas, and how old were you, and what were the circumstances?
I had my freshman year at college at the University of Michigan. And while I was there, I met Ed. Mm-hmm. And he was a graduating senior.
Mm-hmm. Ed was to become your husband.
He was to become my husband. Mm-hmm. Some 7 years later, because the war intervened. I became ill at the University of Michigan. There was an outbreak of a dysentery, which was not amoebic, but it was a viral dysentery of some kind, and the campus was pretty well decimated. And I, unfortunately, contracted it and had to drop out of the University of Michigan, and I spent some months recovering from it and transferred to the University of Chicago, where I got my degree.
Now, what year was this epidemic?
Well,
do you remember? What years are we talking?
We're talking about the 40s.
The 40s, okay.
Right. And so I was fortunate enough. I had begun my second year at the University of Michigan when this outbreak occurred. And I was fortunate enough that the University of Chicago took all of the credits, gave me credit for the courses that I took. And so I was able to graduate with my class, and that was the class of 42.
The class of
42 at the University of Chicago. I got a degree in political science at the University of Chicago.
That does not
Loved
me.
it, and lived for a time. This was a great period in my life because I was fortunate enough to live at International House. How I managed to get in there. See, it was such a commute. We lived at a polar distance from the campus, the University of Chicago campus. We lived north, campus was south, and the commute became such a burden. So I was fortunate enough to get to live at International House and met young people from all over, of course. The sad part of that was, remember the years, okay, and remember Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
At International House, there was a group of wonderful Japanese students. They were Niseis. They were born in the United States, but there was a cluster of them, and I watched the marshals march those kids away at the at the, you know, the excitement and the all of the terror notions that had occurred. These students were marched away, and they were among those that were later put in our camps.
In California.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I lost track, but
Mm-hmm.
I remember that so clearly.
That must have been indelible, and I have a feeling that had something to do with your work later on when you came to Dallas.
It's hard to know. It's hard to know. I'm not sure what influenced that, except, you know, in those years there was an expectation that you had to involve yourself in community affairs, and particularly in Jewish affairs. So when we moved to Dallas, Ed and I, and we moved in 1946.
1940, right after the war.
Right after the war. He had, for 7 years, we corresponded, and he wrote magnificent letters from the front. He was in the infantry, and he was drafted and served for years as in the European theater, and then gradually got, I think he was a captain at the time that he left, you know, the war was over, and it was immediately thereafter that, after all of these years of correspondence, that we got married.
Did you marry in Chicago and then move to Dallas?
We married in Chicago, which is, of course, my home, was my home. Moved to Dallas, didn't know a soul here. But somebody had given me Lorraine Sulkin's, then Sulkin's, name.
Explain who Lorraine Sulkin.
Lorraine Sulkin, no, I've got the
I
name.
think that's right.
Yeah.
Sulkin.
Right. She was active in the community, but that isn't what prompted our friendly relationship, because Dallas is not a friendly, open city. It wasn't then, it isn't now, and but she had a coterie of friends and included us from the beginning. Many of these who became our friends were people these were doctors and so on, who had served in the Army or in the armed forces and had lived in Texas, had been in camps in Texas. Married Texas women.
And stayed in Texas.
And well,
yes.
went back home and then came back
Uh-huh.
and lived in Texas. And
So you were all in the same boat, sort of.
that's right.
Uh-huh.
But so we formed very real friendships here. Of course, Lorraine's husband subsequently died, and the group broke up. It, you know, inevitably it did.
But all right, so can you tell me what Dallas was like at that time that you came here, right after the war, and the Jewish community maybe particularly?
Well,
You already alluded to it a little.
yeah, I think one needs to think about what Dallas was, aside from the Jewish community, for a moment. When I moved to Dallas, when we moved to Dallas in '46, Northwest Highway was the northernmost boundary.
I remember that.
Beyond that was prairie, literally prairie. And when I see the development now, it's absolutely impossible to believe. The Jewish community was small, but active. Let's see, the rabbi at the time,
Oh, at Emmanuel?
was
Lefkowitz.
Lefkowitz.
Yeah.
And of course the temple was in South Dallas. And it was a time of great foment in the Jewish community over Israel.
Oh.
I don't know if you remember
No.
that, but there was a split, a serious split in the Jewish community over those who wanted to support Israel and those who did not. That split, in some sense, continues, but this was a serious split. So the Jewish community was pretty well roiled up over this issue.
Was Temple Emmanuel pretty involved in terms of being not, I don't want to say anti-Israel, but...
Well, the American Council
Judaism.
of Judaism was very active in the temple.
And that was an anti-Israel.
And that was, yes, it was, we can't do this, Israel, I mean, because Americans will confront a lot of anti-Semitism, we will be accused, as we were, of dual citizenship and that kind of thing. It was an agonizing debate. Lefkowitz himself was really ambivalent about it.
Was he?
Yes, he was. And that resolved itself in a sense that it just had to. The American Council on Judaism lost a lot of its credibility and its power. Younger people, came along, and so it settled down.
Yes, I remember.
It settled down, but it was a real conflict. And then, of course, Levi Olin came on the scene, and he became the conscience of the community.
Yeah. But when did Rabbi Olin come?
Well, I wish I could remember the date.
Well,
I don't remember the date. I do remember that he was a power during the desegregation times. And those were fascinating times.
Okay, we're going to get to that. All right, so just hold that.
Okay.
Because, all right, we talked about a little bit about what you remember about Dallas when you arrived, and I'm glad you talked about the American Council for Judaism. Now, you eventually went to work for the American Jewish Community, and that's how I remember you, as being very much involved in civil rights and social issues of our time. Would you talk about that and tell me about that? What your position was?
Before that period, I was involved in the Federation. I mean, that was
the Jewish
that was comme il faut. I mean, you just were involved. Gus Falk was the regional director of the American Jewish Committee in those years. And I was approached by later Judge Irving Goldberg, Jack Gorin, who was then an executive of Neiman Marcus, and some others, to please somehow become an assistant to Gus. And it seemed like a pretty exciting idea at the time, because Dallas was right at the cusp of the whole civil rights issues. When I first moved to Dallas, blacks sat in the back of the bus. It was a shock. And I was dumbfounded at how quickly one forgot to notice. It just was there. there were black fountains and white fountains and so on and so on. Now, AJC in those years covered itself with glory in a kind of a quiet way. In this way, some of the leaders of AJC were part of the power structure of the city. Sam Bloom.
Good, I was going to name them.
Yeah, Sam Bloom, Julius Scheps, of course Mayor Thornton, not a member of the congregation or the AJC, but they were, this group, along with, I think Willis Tate was then president of SNU.
Yes, he was.
Along with Tate, along with Levi Olin, and there were several others, met to discuss how Dallas could avoid what was going on in Detroit and other places, the riots, the terrible unrest that was going on as the civil rights movement developed.
Now, was this in the 50s or early 60s?
Well, you see, no, it was in the 50s.
Yeah.
Yeah. And these, and I was sort of in there, but not centrally involved, because these guys knew what they were doing. And
At that time, it had to be guys, too.
Oh, it was all guys.
Yeah.
It was all guys. The gender thing came later, but they decided, meeting after meeting, and Levi was part of that group, and so was, well, of course, these were AJC, the Jews on that committee were all AJC people, and they decided that what was happening elsewhere could not be permitted to happen in Dallas. And this was a little cabal. This is the smoke-filled room. But you have to honor those guys, because they took charge, and they said very quietly, they said, we are not going to have any riots in Dallas.
And what did they do?
What did they do? They decreed, because they had the power to do so, that the places, hotels, restaurants would permit blacks. Okay. There was resistance. Sam Bloom, the Bloom Agency at the time, he was the head of it. Monumental figure. Did you know?
I just heard about him so much.
As a younger man, he was a mountain. He walked into a room, and this rumbling, huge man. You know, he lost a lot of weight later. But he was a walking volcano. He was a remarkable man.
Lucky for us.
Oh, were we not lucky? And Julius, and of course Irving and Levi. Sam, head of this agency, said, this is what we're going to do. In every paycheck, in every major company in Dallas, there was a notice that the places of accommodation were to be desegregated, and knew that everyone was willing to cooperate.
Wow.
It was a remarkable feat. And not that there wasn't resistance. Of course there was. Some of the restaurants, but gradually. This theme, Dallas is different. Dallas is going to not convulse itself over this. We're just going to do it. And they did it.
You mean to tell me that every paycheck of a major company
Of a major company.
received a little notice?
That's right.
And who signed that notice?
You know, I don't remember.
But it was, they knew it was the authority of the city.
Right.
What were they called? Wait, what was the group called that ran the city at that
Yeah,
time?
right.
The council, wait.
That's right.
Whatever.
That's right.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
This story I did not
Yeah,
know.
and it's a marvelous story.
Oh,
It really is a marvelous story. Today, you know, we rail against the smoke-filled rooms and how small groups used to make decisions for the city, and they did. And this was, today it wouldn't have been tolerated. But in those years, they did yeoman service, and you can't fault them. Even though they counseled with nobody, they were their
Was
own
it
power.
democratic?
No, it was not. But decisions were made. Talk about top-down decisions.
Fabulous story.
Right.
Well, all right, so you at that time...
I was
you
an
were the
assistant director at that time. And interestingly enough, AJC, which is, after all, this marvelous human relations agency, had never had a woman as a field director. As a matter of fact, AJC...
So you were the first.
I was the first. AJC was a national organization.
Yeah, explain that.
It was only later, when I say national, they operated out of New York. Their leadership was, you know, sterling, if not platinum. These were people who were movers and shakers, to use the cliche.
Do you remember some of their names, or would we know them in battles?
We would, only, you see, if you had permitted me to do some homework.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, right.
Continue.
And the staff was marvelous. I remember David Danzig. I don't know if you ever knew David. These were top-flight people.
In human relations.
In human relations. They understood political processes. They were, of course, there was a religious, you know, there was a head of Jewish affairs, but also international. These were international people and so on. They were marvelous. Well, they later decided that maybe it was time that AJC would become a membership organization. It really wasn't then. There were members, there was a scatteration of members who contributed and the like, but there was no field operation.
Really? Oh.
Right. Or very little. So they decided, Dallas was among the first that had, you know, a regional office. Regional offices no longer exist in the AJC, as you know. Now there are individual, you know,
In
there's a
big
Houston
Yes.
office and
Atlanta,
a Dallas office, Atlanta. But there were regions in their first concept of how to make this more of a grassroots organization. It was an elitist organization. And how to do that. And I came on at that time when that transition was beginning. And when Gus retired soon after this whole, I can't remember, but I became assistant director, and then on his retirement, he left, I became the Southwest Regional Director. And these were regional directors, that is to say, my turf included Arkansas, Oklahoma, as well as Texas.
I did not know that.
Right. And so I traveled a good deal creating programs and so on, and it was, these were very exciting years for me as the AJC moved from being strictly a New York and international organization to being an institution that involved members.
Well, you know, I remember that we used to call on you a lot for when we had certain problems and issues. For instance, at Arthur Kramer School, do you remember that? We had some problems with, something with the PTA
Yes,
and,
right.
and bigotry or religion in the schools. And Billie, you were the one that we called on.
Yes.
To help
Well,
us.
and that was the role of the regional director, and of course I was very much interested in that anyway. Part of my growth, and it really was growth, was first I was fortunate enough, since I was the onlyest woman director, to be summoned to New York a lot. I was on committees, and so I practically commuted to New York. Well, I frequently did, and watched the development of the organization, and learned, you know, sat at the feet of some of these people. But the thing that I discovered about myself was I was interested in organizational dynamics. How do groups organize to be effective? What do you have to do? Here is a membership organization, but a membership organization is nothing if there isn't a mobilization of the talents involved. How do you really do that? And how do you relate to the community at large? These were odd days. Anti-Semitism in the early years was very palpable. If Jews were accused of running everything, but in fact there was only one banker that was Jewish.
Fred Florence.
Fred Florence.
Yeah, yeah.
And Jews did not run the community, but that was beside the point. My interest then became, how do I learn to really know the dynamics of organizations at work? And so I spent my vacations going to this marvelous organizational retreat. This was the National Training Laboratories, NTL, the national, it was called National Training Laboratories for Applied Behavioral Science.
Wow.
And it just woke me up.
Now this had nothing to do with American Jewish Committee.
It had nothing to do, that is to say, AJC didn't send me there.
Yes.
I used my vacation time that way. I used my vacation time subsequently to get a master's degree in public administration. But this training of how do you deal with groups was just invaluable to me as an AJC regional director.
Well, then my next question would be, how did you apply that in Dallas? Because when I think of committee, American Jewish Committee, I think of building coalitions.
Right.
Now, with that...
That was part of it. That was a very important part of AJC. It still is. But yes, but how do you build coalitions? How do you work with groups who have never worked with a Jewish organization before? How do you involve other faith groups? How do you, one of the things that I learned quickly was neighborhoods were mobilizing. how do you help that process? So AJC, it wasn't, you know, I broke out of the strictly Jewish context to work in developing some of the grassroots organizations that later on took real life and mobilized on their own.
Can you remember the names of any of those?
Well, these were neighborhood organizations
Really?
who really wanted to get things done. Later, after I left, when did I leave AJC? I retired from AJC and sort of put my own shingle out. But even during the AJC years, I worked very closely, not only with neighborhood organizations, but Black and Hispanic organizations. It was part of the job. And that in itself, the growth of the mobilization, the self-mobilization of minority groups here is another whole story, and AJC played a role in that we lent some leadership to that.
In other words, you're saying that at that time, the blacks weren't organized.
Well,
the Hispanics, they needed help with organization and building.
You see, this was still a turbulent time. And that's right. Outside of marching, what do you do? But marching, valuable as it was to call attention to the whole civil rights, all of the civil rights issues, marching really doesn't do it. It calls attention to it, but that is not organizational building. How do you do that? And it was this training that I had enabled me later, after I really left AJC, to work with the Dallas Alliance. That was the big.
And tell me about the Dallas Alliance.
Well, the Dallas Alliance was
And do we have any dates on this? Can you remember the dates on the Dallas?
Well,
the 50s, still the late 50s?
no, it was later.
The 60s?
But Annette Strauss organized as mayor.
Oh, really?
It was her vision. She thought we needed a vehicle, a mechanism to pull minorities together with whites, because there were very great fissures in the community, lots of anger. And she asked Tom Dunning to be the head of that.
And Tom Dunning was, you want to tell us who he is?
Well, Tom Dunning may be running for mayor.
Oh, okay.
He's been a public figure for a long time, actually. He is he has a very successful insurance company, but he has been active in the community for eons, in every aspect of it.
And the American Jewish Committee honored him, I think, a few
Yes,
years ago.
right. And so he asked me to be the facilitator. And this was an undertaking. And now I'm trying to remember. I think I had left AJC
I think
by
you
that
had
time.
that.
And this would have been in the 70s.
Yeah, I think so, because Annette Strauss
And that was the mayor.
maybe in the 80s. Was she mayor in the 80s?
Well, you tell me. Yeah.
Well, all right.
All right.
We'll have to look that up.
But the interesting thing, the fascinating thing about that, and this went on and on and on. Helen Giddings later became the executive director She's now in the Congress of the United States. She is an African-American woman, wonderful, bright, brilliant. But those meetings of the Dallas Alliance were so astounding because they brought together people who had never sat at the same table, who had never, blacks, leaders in the African American community who had never talked to a white leader, only, they were like that.
Yes.
Ships that passed in the night angrily.
Yes, very good.
And these sessions were remarkable in that it really changed the tone. Jack Lowe, do you remember Jack Lowe? Sr. was one of the geniuses also behind this. He died in the midst of it. But he really gave such meaning to it. And Jack Lowe Jr., who now is the business that he heads, which was Jack Lowe Sr., was for a time the head of the Dallas Alliance.
Were there Jews on this Dallas Alliance, and who were they? Do you remember the names?
Well, on the board.
On the board?
Yeah. Cheryl was a member of the board.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I think not. I was going to say Milton and Toby, and Milton, of course, succeeded me as the executive director
American Jewish
of the American Jewish
Right.
Committee, and he took on all of the relationships and coalition building. He was very good at that. I'm trying to remember when I retired from AJC, when I left AJC. Isn't that funny? My memory, it's like a stream.
Well, all of us, but all right, let's think from the assassination, which was 1963. Were you still with the American Jewish Committee with the Kennedy assassination?
No, I was then with the Dallas Alliance as a consultant.
Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a embarkation there.
Well, let me see. I was with the AJC because the Alliance didn't come until later.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, we had a downtown office.
I remember that. And
Right.
so did Federation.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right. And so I was still with AJC. And I was standing outside of our building.
Is that
Cars drove
Mhm.
by
Mhm.
to Kennedy's death. We were very much, yes, Gus Falk was still on the scene because I don't know if you remember, I'm jumping around.
That's fine,
Yeah.
that's right.
I don't know if you remember that Kennedy's trip here was preceded by an ad in the Dallas Morning News, full page with a black border, paid for by the John Birch Society, which was very active, saying, "Welcome, Mr. President," and in very castigating terms. And the upshot of that was that people blamed Dallas. In other words, it was Dallas that assassinated the president. It wasn't Oswald, it was Dallas. And that this was planned. I do remember that the FBI visited our office house.
Really?
And one reason for that was that, unbeknownst to me, you know, I would speak at various groups, and I had no knowledge that at one of those interfaith groups or whatever it was, Oswald was there.
Really?
With Myrna, was that her name?
Mm-hmm.
And the woman who had befriended.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that, but the FBI knew that. This was, of course, before the assassination, but came around
To check on
to check on it and to check on me.
Mm-hmm. Now, this ad that you speak about, was this in the purview of the American Jewish Committee to sort of run that down? And were you...
Well, remember ADL was very much
Oh, that's
active
right.
also.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, everybody tried to run it down. We knew it was the John Birch Society. And you have to hearken back at how many right-wing bigots there were around in the Dallas area. Well, everywhere. In Arkansas, you know,
South.
in the South. But of course, Dallas was...
So did you do, when you were with AJC then, did you do a lot of speaking before groups?
Oh, yes. That was part of the coalition building
That's
anyway.
right.
And it was part of an education process. The Jewish community, small but growing, there were people who had never seen Jews before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you know, who are these people?
Yeah.
And it was really part of my job.
Well, I remember, I think you did maybe a workshop or something on deflating the bigot. Do you remember there was a brochure or something from the American Jewish Committee?
Right.
And I remember,
What would happen was that the national organization would publish these wonderful things, and then we were encouraged to take them to our membership. And how do you do that? So you did workshops and so on. And of course, again, subsequently, I conducted that leadership course at City Hall. You know,
tell me about that.
Well, that was, when did that fit in? That was part of, I think, what I was doing after I put my shingle out.
Okay. And tell us what your shingle was. You
were a
consultant,
yeah,
right?
I became a consultant, and I consulted with a lot of organizations initially, and then since I never advertised, it sort of dwindled. And I don't know why I didn't, you know, do more, but I did.
You might have been tired.
Yeah,
then.
right.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah.
But I did a leadership training course at the location was City Hall. And this was part of the Dallas Alliance.
Okay, so this was later on, okay.
But this was, it was a 6-session course. Every kind of leadership development, whether that was planning, action, coalition building, how you resolve conflicts. It was how do you personally solve problems as well as within a group. Problem solving was very heavily involved in all of those sessions. How do you mobilize for action? And Terrell Bolton, our police chief, the chief of police.
Oh, Bolton, sure.
Okay, was a sergeant,
Oh.
and he was in my class.
Oh,
And we are still, you know, I still hear from him.
And he was so special.
He was very special. He was the smartest kid in the class. And he just soaked it up, all of those leadership
Well, he had that sensitivity, and I didn't know that you had something to do with it.
Well, he had something to do with it, but indeed, he attended every session, and we had firemen, we had police officers besides Terrell. We had neighborhood people, but we also had business people. It was a wonderfully mixed bag of people who just signed on and wanted that kind of training. It was a wonderful experience for me, and it went on. For I guess 3 or 4 years.
It did.
Yeah.
What a contribution you made to the city of Dallas.
And well,
I mean, that's before we were talking about dispute mediation. Isn't that a lot of what you did?
well, that was part of it. But one of the strengths of that course was I used the resources of the community. So when we were talking about how do you resolve conflicts, the dispute mediation service was already in
Oh, it
existence.
was.
And so Herb Cook would be a resource
dear
person.
friend.
Yeah, right. And so we tried to get the really viable resource people in the community to come in and work with the students who signed up.
Fabulous. You did that for 3 years?
Yeah, at least, I think, right. And then it just, then the Dallas Alliance ended. I ended when the Dallas Alliance ended because...
you ended professionally.
Professionally. Well, I tried to go on, but that didn't work out. But the Alliance still exists, but in a different form. Now, wonderful African-American guy, Pettis Norman, now heads it. And they do their thing, but it's quite a different organization. They don't hold meetings as such. They kind of consult with groups, and Tom Dunning, I think, is still active in it, and others that I'm not connected with it at all.
Where do they meet? Do they meet?
I'd have no idea. No, I just
Times
don't
have
know.
changed.
Oh yeah, of course,
Yeah.
and that is a whole other subject.
Well, that's what I want to. I mean, looking back, okay, boy, have things changed. Do you wonder what was accomplished? I mean, we're still dealing with some of the same issues that we thought were resolved: parent schools, public schools, the integration of public schools, racial issues, interest groups that are only interested in their own interests and don't cross the board. How do you feel?
Well, let me give you my perspective.
Great. Talk on.
AJC always emphasized pluralism, and I believed and believe in pluralism. That is that there never was a melting pot. That was a fiction. Who was it? Franz Werfel, who created it, and old Henry Ford took it on and had this stage production. This is, I think, before time even, where I know it was before. We're going back a long way to the immigrants among them from Eastern Europe.
Yes.
A lot of Jews. Okay.
My father.
Right. My parents as well. And the idea of the melting pot was very gripping and seductive. And old Henry, picking up the theme, would stage a production where the actors would slouch in with dirty clothes, filthy, curved backs, and go into this melting pot and emerge as real Americans. Okay, it was part of the bigotry of the time. So AJC rejected the whole idea of the melting pot. There never was a melting pot because people wanted to maintain some hold on their own cultures, on their own history. Okay? So we developed the concept, we AJC, of pluralism. That is to say, no melting pot, but a kind of fruit salad, if you were. Leon Raven was fond of calling it a fruit salad. That is to say, you had the group, but within the citizenry, blacks wanted to be blacks and nurture their culture, Hispanics, etc., even Native Americans. Okay, well, we nurtured that, we, the AJC, so that we helped blacks and other minorities to mobilize for their own interests. I was very involved in that. And as I look back, you asked me the question, I think we never anticipated that the logical outcome of pluralism was fragmentation. That each group was demanding its own place in the sun, but at the expense of other groups. In other words, I not only want my piece of the action, I want your piece of the action. And the African American groups were the first to seize the day. They were followed by the Latinos. The Native Americans are still working on it. And in came an influx of Asians who hadn't a clue about how you mobilize for action. As a matter of fact, the Asian American Chamber of Commerce was kind of the umbrella for that. But within that, I mean, the Vietnamese didn't speak to the Uyghurs and the Chinese and the so on and so on. But here was this great surge of identity. I am an African American. And on the one hand, it was the ultimate of pluralism. I mean, this was marvelous. On the other hand, it fragmented, and I think it's still fragmented. I was going to say this community, but I think every community. Although there may be, I see now that coalitions are again forming. Interest coalitions are again forming. But I have long considered that all my work was a failure.
Oh, no.
Well, in the sense that I helped build this pluralism. I believed so deeply in it.
I know you did.
And here's the outcome. The outcome was fragmentation. And now I think it's being put back together again. That is to say, people are really talking to people. but you have an influx of, we have the Muslim or group that's really burgeoning here. So you have little factions still. You have the Native Americans are still not organized, but getting there. But and even within the Asian community, while they get together now and again, there's the Chinese community, or there's the Vietnamese community, and and there's the Korean community, and so on and so on. I don't know what the outcome of that will be. I think it's going to be okay, but it breaks my heart to see that our vision, HAC's vision and my vision, was that yes, you needed to cultivate your identity, but then you would be part of this larger, wonderful
The American experience.
experience. Right.
And there's no other country in the world
That's right.
that mixes
That's
the
right.
way we do.
That's
So
right.
I think we're probably still in the American experience.
I think we are, and I think, oddly enough, we're in the early stages of a citizenry that is, yes, concerned with its own identity, but concerned with the community at large. I think there's a faint beginning of that.
Well, I think that there has to be.
Oh,
we're
there
in trouble.
We are, and we have been in trouble.
Yes.
But there's still, in my judgment, a lot of fragmentation going on. But at the same time, there are coalition builders at work.
Well, that should certainly make
And
you feel good.
Yeah, right. Well,
Your
but-
work was not a failure, but one more question. I mean, Jews, of course, we have years of history of integrating, I guess. The Jews have done very well in this country.
The Jews have done very well in Dallas, and in the country. I think we have a long history of learning how. You don't have to go too far back to think of how frightened everyone was. That's why the American Council for on Judaism, whatever it was for Judaism, was formed. This fear that our being here is still so fragile. And of course, it's only in America,
Yes, only in America.
Only in America. Because in every other country, religious the exercise of religion is controlled by the state, even in England, and the crown decides. So there goes my voice.
Well, I think we can finish up. I think the Dallas community is very lucky to have somebody like you immigrate to our great city.
I'm so lucky to live here.
Yeah.
I love this city.
It's mutual. It really is. And this was just a great interview. And thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.